Thank you, Nicole, and welcome.
Thank you. I just want to say hi, you mob, and I'm Nicole Hewlett, and I'm a proud Palawa woman from Lotrawita in Tasmania, and I present to you today from Turrbal and Yagara lands of Mianjin in Brisbane. I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging of this beautiful country, and extend this same respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching this today.
Thank you. Now, we're just going to get you to start off by telling us a bit about the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Is our map up on screen? Awesome. So as you can see, if you have a look at the map here, it's a map of all the different Aboriginal language groups that we have here in Australia, and there are about roughly 300, and each community varies not only according to geographic location, environment, and resources, but they each have their own unique cultural practices, histories, languages, beliefs, knowledge, and kinship systems. And even within these communities, there are significant variability and nuances with families within each community and the songlines that get handed down. So you can imagine how, given the diversity, how overwhelming it can be when someone is asked to speak on behalf of all of Aboriginal peoples. You can only ever do that sort of thing in a very vague and broad sense. And then when we add our Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, then well, they may as well be in a completely different country and culture altogether. And I certainly cannot speak on behalf of these mob any more than I could speak on behalf of, say, a Chinese person. But I do pass on information and advocate on their behalf when I have their permission.
That's great, thank you. So what are some of the things, given that we've talked about diversity already, but what are some of the things that are similar across cultures in terms of understanding health and well-being?
I suppose, I mean, one of the very similar things that I'm sure everyone's aware of is our history of oppression and dispossession, which meant for a lot of us denying our identity in order to be classified as human or as a citizen of Australia so that we could access privileges and a better life. And I suppose given this history of colonisation, it's really important to emphasise that if someone identifies as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, it does not necessarily mean that they're automatically connected to culture, country and kinship. The stolen generations, for example, meant that many Aboriginal kids were removed from their families and communities and raised to be non-Indigenous, with no information given to them about their heritage. So I just wanted to premise with that before I talk about some of the similarities across our cultures traditionally. So traditionally, and for a lot of us Aboriginal people today and Torres Strait Islander peoples, even those that have taken on other introduced religions like Christianity, our beliefs around health and well-being are grounded in a sense of belonging. So it's a belonging to land, to sea, other people, to one's culture. So many of us believe that we come from the land, and when we pass, we go back to the land, and that we are all on this, we are all spirits, and we're on this life, death, life continuum. And if you can see there's a artwork which sort of captures that life, death, life continuum done by Uncle Mick Connolly there. Many of us believe that all living things, so people, animals, plants, rocks, all have a spirit, and that these spirits connect the living to the past, present, and the future, and that we, including myself, are connected to our ancestors through things like country and ceremony, and even ourselves with our stories. And we're also connected to the ancestors of the future because we are the ancestors of the future. So you can see why country is so significant to us. It is our connection to our past in terms of our ancestors. It's important to our present day in terms of our health, that it's connected to us through our future. In Aboriginal society, everything and everyone is interrelated, it's interconnected. The land, family, stars, there's a oneness, and this is what we call the dreaming. For Torres Strait Islander peoples, their spirituality tends to draw more upon stories of Tagai. So given this perspective, our health and well-being is extremely holistic, as you can tell, and it's transcendent. And when it comes to palliative care, many of us need to return spirit back to country in order for that life, death, life journey to continue. Different communities have different protocols and ceremonies around that, but traditionally the life-death-life continuum and the relationship to country is a similar theme across all of our cultures.
Oh, that's great, thank you. And I just noticed the comment in the chat, this is so beautiful. So
oh, that's
really,
good.
Really appreciate what you're sharing, Nicole. That's
and
great.
I should also add to that if just because if someone's not on country, so if an Aboriginal person like myself no longer lives on traditional country, that in no way does that diminish our cultural and spiritual connections to country. I think that's important to note as well, because I think a lot of people assume that, oh, well, given that significant connection to country, you expect people to always be on country, but that's not the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. So what are some of the barriers that prevent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from accessing palliative care services?
Well, from our a cultural point of view, I'll go into more of the other barriers in the next question, but similar to a lot of cultures, some of us hold the belief that everything happens for a reason. So if you have cancer, it's because you've done something wrong to invite that sickness. And often mob don't want to share about that because then they will be judged and community will assume that they've done something to have that particular condition or illness. There is also the idea of manifestation. So by somehow talking about it, you then make it more of a reality. You bring it forward somehow, you manifest it. And so if we talk about death and dying or try to prepare, then somehow we have now brought that closer to us because we've talked about it.
In terms of barriers then, what prevents people accessing palliative care? Obviously there's those beliefs that if that would influence that, but what other barriers are there that exist? Well,
at the heart, I mean, there are many barriers, but in my opinion, I think at the heart of those barriers there's two main ones. There's racism in the health system, and then there's community awareness and education of what palliative care is. So we all know there's endless literature on the experience of racism in the health systems for our mob, and so many of us have received culturally unsafe and poorer care or no care at all as a result of being Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. And this is a systemic barrier across the nation because these institutions are non-Indigenous and therefore they're intrinsically built in non-Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. And that's often at odds with our ways. So in terms of our community, we've been doing palliative care and looking after our elders and those that are sick since the dawn of time, but we don't call it palliative care. It's not our language and we don't actually have a word for it. Those that are familiar with the word palliative, they have very terrible experiences that are associated with that word, and those experiences are whether it be in hospitals or by individuals. And these sorts of experiences and stories flood our grapevines in every community. And now that we have things like Facebook and the like, those stories are faster and more furious than they've ever been. And so for many, the word palliative care is quite stigmatized, and there is often a lot of misunderstanding of what it actually is. And for those that have or are a little bit familiar with it, it's often associated with negative things like death, pain, loss, trauma. And so a lot of mobs tend to steer quite clear of anything to do with palliative, the word, if palliative is in it. And they refer to the workforce often as the Grim Reaper workforce. And this often means that our communities are caring for sick family members and they're caring for them alone without any sort of support and without resources. And that's one thing that IPEPA is, hoping to change as we move forward.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a story to me last week when we were having this conversation about an example of an auntie in dialysis. Do you want to just share that story just to illustrate that?
Yeah, so on a lot of these grapevines, there's, every day there would be a new person filming about their experience in hospital or with a particular service. And this one was of an auntie getting dialysis, and even though it wasn't the nurse treating her, she overheard a conversation of a gentleman in the bed next to her, and the nurse was talking to him, and he was referring to abos this, abos that, in a very derogative sort of way. And the nurse sort of chimed in, and even though, you know, the nurse was probably looking to make her client comfortable, our mob are hearing this, and it gives this man, and it gives her this permission to use words like this, which are very derogative to us, and it makes for a very culturally unsafe atmosphere for us.
Yeah, I guess that illustrates the point about cultural safety being the experience of the person and not, you know, something that you do. It's how a person feels in that care.
And it's with everyone, because you never know who's listening, and it adds to the culture of a place, those sorts of things that are allowed to continue, and those sorts of conversations that are not pulled up. And people, including kids, are listening to these things. And so, you know, there is a responsibility for all of us in all of our interactions to be culturally safe, regardless of whether the person that you are talking to or caring for is Aboriginal or not.
Yeah. So with that in mind, what's the most important thing that health professional students, particularly those you know, in their entry to practice or undergraduate courses, what is the most important thing that they need to learn in order to be able to go on?
I could go all day on this one, so it's hard to say just one thing. Probably for entry to practice, deep, genuine listening. You are at the start of your entry to practice journey, so I imagine that you'd be going through various culturally responsive courses, and you'll begin to understand the importance of critical reflection in unpacking things like unconscious bias, etc. But when it comes to our mob and providing tailored, culturally responsive care, there will be no lesson like the lesson you get from having an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person sitting in front of you and you really listening to them. Often, you know, if you're an entry to practice, you might be quite nervous and caught up in your head about everything that you've learned, and you're trying to recall acronyms of how to be appropriate, and you're playing it all out at once. So should I look at them in the eyeballs? Should I not? Should I, you know, hug them, kumbaya, whatever? You've got a circus of things going on in your head, and that can often disconnect you because you lose the realness because you're caught up in your head. For us and for many cultures, storytelling is a beautiful bridge to building intimacy, trust, and connection. So when you have the privilege of sitting in front of and caring for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, share your story, and not your professional one. We don't care if you graduated from Apple's University or have a deadly Instagram account with 5 stars. We want to connect with you. Like, where did you come from? Who's your family? Why are you here today sitting in front of me? And then tell me that you know nothing about my journey and that you're here to listen and learn. And I think it's really as simple as that at this stage.
That's great. That's a really good one thing. Not an easy one thing.
I probably snuck like 20 things in there, but you know.
It's a good thing to remember. Thank you. So we have some time now for questions for Nicole, and I'm sure you all have some burning questions to ask.
Hi, Nick. Quite often in my role, I'm approached by academics who are non-Indigenous and they're not comfortable, or they don't feel they should be teaching some of this content. Would you like to comment on that?
I think, I mean, we're only 3% of the population. So, you know, there will come a time where, yeah, you do have to, you know, teach this because there's not someone available to do it. And it's not a good enough excuse not to teach about these sorts of things or not to teach Black history in schools because it's not done by an Aboriginal person. Obviously, in an ideal world, yeah, by an Aboriginal person is great. But I think there is a lot of benefit in a non-Indigenous person and their journey of learning in this space as well that your students can relate to. And I think sharing that journey, and also with the, you know, with the premise that, you know, you are obviously not Aboriginal and you cannot speak on behalf of all of this, but this is what you do know so far. And if there are any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room, invite them to have some input if they feel comfortable to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think it is important for everyone to acknowledge that. And as you say, there are very limited numbers of Indigenous academics.
Absolutely.
Suzanne's made a lovely comment in the chat box there about how incorporating the environment can help people feel welcomed and culturally included. Suzanne, did you want to read your comment?
Yes, sorry. So I grew up in the Northern Territory, and so and started my health career in the Northern Territory, both in Darwin and Katherine and Alice Springs. So I know that although that there are some magnificent hospitals there that are built on, you know, hospitals that look like they are down south, some of them are built specifically for the Indigenous population. And so the Katherine Hospital was one of them, and it had a huge veranda all out the front, because a lot of your patients would invariably not want to sit in their beds all day and they'd all go outside. And so it was very inclusive in that way. So I feel like I've been very privileged, and I like the way, Nick, that you talked about saying that what you don't know, but in particular talking about your own story and listening to the story, because I've learnt most of what I know from actually doing stuff and being there, rather than actually having to listen to academics try and tell me what it's like. But I think hearing other people's stories, whether they're from your own culture or someone else's culture, has been my greatest learning with caring for Indigenous people. Yeah.
That's beautiful, Suzanne. Thank you.
Have we got any other questions? Oh, we have a question in the chat from Janine. Nick, you spoke of songlines before. I'm hearing that term more often with an expectation that the general population know what it means and the importance of it. Can you explain what songlines means for us?
Yeah, so I suppose in the weave of life and in a lot of our storytelling, there's this belief that each of us have, I suppose in English, it would be like your destiny. So each of us have a destiny, and we're part of the fabric that we're guided by our ancestors, and this forms our songline. So it is what we dedicate our life to. So a lot would say that, you know, my songline is in palliative care. So I need to make a certain, as part of my songline or a part of my life cycle and my physical presence in this particular life, I need to do certain things as part of that songline, so that the next songline can begin, which might be my kids or whatever, whoever else is crossing my songline path. So it's almost like a life path. Does that make sense? It's probably not. It does. I don't know if I can explain it as well. The English language becomes quite limited at times when you're talking about things like that are associated with dreaming and with the Aboriginal cultures. It's because a lot of it's not oral. It's yeah, beyond that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's good to know. Any other questions at the moment? Narelle says, Nick, I'm working in palliative care. I'm trying to work on bringing country to patients who aren't able to go home. Any ideas there?
Yeah, some people actually get a jar of country from where they're from and bring it in, and that's had some beautiful effects for a lot. Other people show videos or have crackling fire, so they use digital technologies to bring country into the room, and that's one of the beautiful things about, you know, digital technologies these days. It's so realistic, and so that can often have the same experience as connecting in person to country. So yeah, take advantage and offer that to your clients wherever you can, because you'll be surprised at how significant such seemingly small things can be.
And I know just listening to watching the Palliative Care Australia webinar that was on recently for NAIDOC Week, there's a few conversations about how to bring country to people and some of the things you've mentioned too. So yeah, we recommend that one, Narelle, as well. What was it called? Footprints, Final Footprints? I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, Final Footprints is a new video resource that Palliative Care Australia has just put out, but the webinar around that was done in NAIDOC week, and I think it was Having a Yarn or something was the title. So you should be able to find that in there. We've got time for one or two more questions, and Suzanne says, I wonder if there's an opportunity for virtual country to be used using virtual 3D apps.
Yeah, bring it on.
I guess the sky's the limit, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And another question about, is there generally a fear of death in Indigenous culture or a welcoming, and about the spirit world and interaction with past ones?
I think, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of everyone. For some, absolutely. It's not dissimilar to every other culture. Yes, there's going to be some people that have a, particularly those that perhaps subscribe more to things like Christianity, where this concept of hell now exists. You know, traditionally we didn't have these concepts in our culture, so hell wasn't a thing, so there wasn't anything to fear. But now with introduced religion, yeah, there are certainly communities that now have got a fear, because there is the possibility of something else now that's much worse. But yeah, but while for others it's still that life, death, life continue, that we go back to country and we continue our journey. I know I believe that. So for me, passing will be as much as a celebration or as much sort of ceremony as my birth into the physical world.
We did have one conversation just earlier today about Indigenous healthcare students, so students in our courses who are Indigenous. You know, what kind of, what should we be thinking about in terms of approaching learning for them?
In terms of creating learning from them or getting learning from them?
So if we're teaching a course and of health professional students, and we have Indigenous students in the course, we realise that that conversations around death and dying and palliative care can be very sensitive business, and also that, you know, there's a different cultural perspective. So I guess what would you suggest for educators in terms of including those people in the learning the best way?
Well, I think exactly doing that, like acknowledging that there are sensitivities, because you're not just talking to Aboriginal people. There are a lot of cultures with these sorts of sensitivities. So I imagine when you're presenting, you know, education in this space, it's the same as delivering palliative care. You need to think about the entire context, which is the people that are involved, and how to acknowledge it at the same time as going, this is part of your work now. I imagine if someone has selected to be coming into palliative care, that they've already gone through all of the process in their own minds around talking about death and dying, and they've, you know, and that's why they're here.
Thank you.
It's definitely important to acknowledge and also to invite, you know, different perspectives. Like give people an opportunity to talk about it from their point of view, because there's a lot of learning that can happen in a two-way kind of experience for other students in there in the same classroom.
Great, thank you.
I've got a question. I've worked in aged care for a long, long time, and I now train it. And I have looked after a number of Indigenous residents that have come into the facility. And what I found was that when the end of life comes, like terminal illnesses there, and the end of their lifespan, I found that there was not enough information for the carers to be able to know how to care. That means anyone that's done the clinical part of it. And understanding, then you said before, that there's over 300 different cultures, you know, like different aspects of Indigenous Aboriginals in Australia. How then can you then address the needs of that specific person that's going through, and that family that's going through that end of life stage in their how do you go about that?
In those situations, if the sick person can't sort of navigate a lot of this or speak on behalf of themselves, at IPEPA we really promote family-centred care for community. So it really comes down to taking the entire family on the journey. Because like you said, every single person is going to be different, and their needs at the end of life is going to be as varied as what it is for any one of us, no matter how we identify. And I think it's important to, and I do come up against this a lot around people or mainstream health workers not understanding kinship structures. So when you do go to the family, it's really important to understand who you should be talking to, because just in mainstream, you might assume that the next of kin might be blah, blah. But in Aboriginal communities, the community is structured in a completely different way. And it doesn't mean that a blood relative will be the one that is classified as family that will speak on behalf. So when you're going in and looking about how you might support this person, the first thing that's important to identify is who you should be talking to when you talk to the whole family, and who will be that person. And it starts with having a family conference. I find a lot of people benefit a lot in a two-way learning when they bring the whole family on board, even if it's for little things like building that trust relationship. I know one person spoke of how amazing or how much it helped when a nurse put up on a whiteboard everything about the medicines that they were giving their uncle, and all of the medicines that they were giving before, they didn't understand what they did. All they saw was stuff going into their uncle and him getting more and more vague and having negative kind of symptoms. They didn't understand that it was actually taking away pain. It was doing this, it was doing that. And that can start to build emotions for the family because they don't understand what's going on. And if you don't know anything, then fear starts, particularly when you're involved with a system that's not your system. So I encourage complete transparency in all of the care, and that transparency has to go to all of the family. Because only by doing that will you better understand, okay, so when I take this whole family on the journey, they will then identify the person that will be the next of kin that you need to continue conversations with and in how best to support this particular person that's sick. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. Yes, it does make a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Nick.
Just talking about balancing how some people might prioritise their clinical need or their physical needs lower than their cultural or spiritual needs at the end of life. And how do you, I guess, balance that as a clinician?
Well, there's no reason that they don't blend, you know, because we all want to be comfortable at the end of life. That's just a human thing, not necessarily a cultural thing. And it's also good for the family to make sure that they, you know, the people that they love aren't in pain. So I don't necessarily see there's a difference. Where the difference is how you communicate that to the family. And that's what's important, is just transparency in everything that you do, because you need to remember what you represent. You represent a system that has been racist, that has caused terrible experiences for these people, that has caused a lot of grief, loss and trauma. So the onus is really on the system and yourselves to show and prove that you are not that system. That's where your mind frame, I suppose, needs to be. You need to prove to our community in order to build that relationship and that trust, because the trust is just not there. And that's based, unfortunately, on all of the experiences that we have all collectively shared. And yeah, and it's through most communities.
Yeah. And I do apologise, I forgot to share this slide earlier. We got too much into the conversation. So
You've ruined everything then.
Another beautiful image there that Nick's provided for us. We also have some resources that Nicole's just put together on this slide, which are all freely available and recommended resources to help your learning and teaching in this content. We'll put that slide up on our resource hub on the Educator Community section of the LMS, so you can access those. But yeah, just wanted to say a huge thank you, Nicole, for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, and for doing it in such a open and sensitive way. So really appreciate. If we could give you a round of applause, we would, but it's a bit challenging.
I'm sensing the standing ovation, Sharon.
Yeah, just take that. That's great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.